every 100 babies born, 50 will be male and 50 will be female. Now that points towards monogamy. One man for one woman when they grow up, the sexual constitution of the West. Each young man gets one young woman and vice versa, and that's it.
I'm very grateful today to be joined by Allan Carlson, who was Distinguished Visiting Professor of Politics and History at Hillsdale College, retiring in 2013. He's currently the John A. Howard Distinguished Fellow for Family and Religious Studies at the International Organization for the Family and editor of The Natural Family, an international journal of research and policy. You might also have come across his work through Touchstone, a journal of mere Christianity. He served for 22 years as editor of the Marriage and Family Studies series for Transaction Books, and he received his PhD in modern European history from The Ohio University. Allan, thank you very much for joining me today.
Pleased to be with you.
So we are here to talk about Louis de Bonald, and he's a big influence on your thinking. For people who've never heard of his name before, I think that's a real shame because he's got so many insightful answers to contemporary problems. Who was he, and what's the most important way in which he has influenced your thinking on the family and society?
Well, let me take that second question first and then go into who he was. Back when I was an undergraduate, about age 19 or 20, at a small Midwestern religious college, I took a course on 19th century European intellectual history. This was 1968, 1969, a time, let us remember, when the campuses around the globe were being torn apart by various forms of radicalism, left-wing enthusiasms. Communism was on the march. The favorite people to be reading at that time were Marx, Lenin to some degree, but Mao Zedong, Che Guevara, on and on through the list. It was a time when the campuses were in turmoil. All of various forms of leftist thought were in the ascendance. So I took this course, and our first book was a collection of essays written by the French reactionaries. This was Francois René Chateaubriand, Joseph de Maistre, and then Louis de Bonald. I was stunned by the book. It was a sheer joy to read. For the first time in reading political philosophy, I felt jubilant after finishing an essay. And this was very strange. I felt maybe I needed to go visit a therapist or something. In the middle of this great enthusiasm for the left, I was getting my intellectual juices flowing by reading the reactionaries of the right. And specifically Bonald was one who I most took shine to, as the saying goes. His focus on the family, on the natural family, his focus on the importance and value of mediating institutions. Again, it felt a thrill. And I knew for the first time that I was something of a conservative, or even worse, or better, a reactionary, as Bonald very much was a reactionary in a correct sense. So that's how I got to know him. And who was he? He, a Frenchman, born 1754 in a rural area of southern France, to an old noble family, had the same estate there for, at that point, about four centuries. Spent time in with the Musketeers until the king abolished that military group. Went back home, settled into his estate, and tried to manage it as best he could. Became the mayor of a nearby town. The French Revolution then came along, 1789, and actually for the first 2 years or so, he was in favor of it. What he thought the French Revolution was going to do was decentralize France, end the efforts by the French monarchy to consolidate power in Paris, restore the privileges and power of the we'll call it local aristocracy, people like his own family, like himself. And again, he centralized the country and this tyranny of the king. That lasted about 2 years until the revolutionary government issued the civil constitution of the clergy, basically, which put Roman Catholicism, Roman Catholic Church, under the thumb of the revolutionary government. Bonald was a strong Roman Catholic, saw this as a direct threat to the church itself, fled the country. 1791, took his two youngest sons with him into Germany, to Heidelberg, and went into exile for a period of about 5 years. He was penniless, but managed to struggle along, and wrote his first book while he was in Heidelberg, a book called A Theory of Power, Political and Religious. And of course, themes of power would work their way through all of his subsequent writings. And then he wrote a second volume called The Natural Laws of the Social Order. And there are those who think that he, in some ways, was the founder of modern social science. While certainly a Christian and a religious man, he tried to build his argument in this case on observation, and what we called collecting the data of a sort, and drawing his judgments from that, not from divine revelation. He went back to Paris to basically hide there. He thought Paris was such a jumbled, chaotic place during these years that he would find a place to hide. Wrote another book called On Divorce, dealing with marriage and divorce, a book I particularly like. When Napoleon came along, Napoleon actually liked Bonald, particularly his defense of a strong king, of a strong monarch, and of a sort, so to speak. And actually tried to draw Bonald back into public service. Bonald resisted, remaining loyal to the old regime and to the old king and to the Bourbon family, but was no longer on the run. When Napoleon was defeated, when the old regime came back in, he served for about 15 years as one of the leading public figures in France, member of the Chamber of Deputies. And he set out to restore the at least key parts of the old regime, to go back to the pre-revolutionary ancient regime of France. He co-founded a journal with Chateaubriand called Le Conservateur, a political journal on conservatism. And the case, I think, can be made that he was one of the founders, or if not the founder, certainly the coiner of the term conservative in its modern meaning. And the journal expressed that. He continued to serve in public life, enjoying some successes. I imagine we'll come back to his successful repeal of divorce, which was quite remarkable, and was active in public life till the Bourbon family was thrown out again in 1830. And at that point, he retired to his estate and spent the next 10 years, his last 10 years of his life, managing the affairs of his estate back in southern France.
Now, one of the interesting reflections he had in the aftermath of the revolutionary terror is that opposing the totalitarian state actually requires defending traditional authority, and that without authority, we get authoritarianism. Why is that? That sounds paradoxical to many people.
Well, he insists that power is a necessary part of human existence. Power will be exercised one way or the other. Tyrannical power, or what he saw, at least in its best forms in the old regime, was power that was in some ways decentralized, absolute within an individual, but otherwise decentralized, power tied to service. He was a defender of the old aristocracy, and saw the propertied, landed aristocrats who stayed on their estates and stayed involved in local affairs as a way in which power took on a positive, or at least the worst aspects of the exercise of power disappeared. The best aspects of it were there. Power tied to service, power tied to duty and responsibility. Now, it is true that many French aristocrats were crowding up to be with the king up in Paris, and for them, I think Bonald held mostly contempt. But the aristocrats who stayed home, so to speak, the ones who stayed involved in their local government, took responsibility for being the mayor, for example, of the town in which next to their estate. These were the people who exercised power and authority in a way that protected human liberty. And again, it is kind of paradoxical, but they were the ones who protected the ability of human beings to create families, to live a good and decent and honorable life.
Power tied to service, a concept that is foreign to many people today, sadly, and has had the exact consequences that he feared it would when we sever those two things. On that theme of severing, he believed that there had to be intermediary societies between the individual and the state. So not just the family, as you've outlined, but also corporations or guilds, and of course, religion too. So why do these intermediary societies matter then?
He understood, and in the 20th century, figures such as Robert Nisbet, who I counted as a mentor and friend, understood it as well. Mediating institutions are what make liberty possible. And by mediating institutions, these are the structures that stand between the individual and the state. It is certainly clear that every revolutionary government, every left-wing government, what they try to do, above all, is destroy the institutions that stand between state and the individual. They want to free the individual from the tyranny of family. They want to free the individual from the tyranny of the church. They want the freestanding individual to enjoy all the claims that the free individual wants, until the mediating institutions are destroyed, at which time the free individual becomes, in fact, the slave of the revolutionary state. Bonald saw that, just as Edmund Burke did in England, and in fact, he was a great admirer of Edmund Burke. But he saw this happening, and clearly understood that the family, in particular, the religious congregation and the church as a whole, the structure of in his case, the Roman Catholic Church, the guilds, the professional associations of their time, which always had a religious element to them as well, which made them different from, say, a modern labor union. But govern quality, entry into the profession, or entry into the trade. These and also localities, local institutions, neighborhoods, the ties and bonds that people have to neighbors over time, in particular. These were the things that protected the individual from the overweening state. And Bonald, along with Burke, saw this keenly and clearly and set out to defend the institutions as he saw necessary to true liberty.
It's a really counterintuitive insight for people nowadays, because what he's saying really is that liberalism, in seeing society as disconnected, atomized individuals, is in fact the precursor or precondition of totalitarianism, because once these intermediary societies are dissolved, as it were, then the individual is absorbed by the state.
The individual is left helpless and has nowhere to turn other than to the state. And you're right, it is. This is the end game of liberalism. They obviously don't talk about it a lot. They prefer to talk about freedom. We're going to give you liberty. We're going to give you freedom. But it's a liberty and a freedom that inevitably results in oppression and a kind of slavery. And it seems counterintuitive, but I think it's absolutely true.
The trouble is that the West now is so worm-eaten with liberalism, and that's what T.S. Eliot called it in his book After Strange Gods, that most people have an antipathy to any mention of the word authority. They don't understand how it's different from mere power. So how is authority different from power?
Authority, to some degree, grows naturally. In fact, one of Bonald's great projects was to rescue the word natural from Rousseau and Rousseau's disciples who built the French Revolution. It's natural in that it grows out of human nature. We'll probably talk more about marriage and divorce a little later here, but marriage, Bonald saw marriage as the beginning of political society as well as human society more broadly. In this sense, he was something of an Aristotelian. Political society grows out of the marriage bond, which then grows into the family, into extended kin, to the neighborhood, and so on. And within the family, a power, an authority emerges as well. Great believer in patriarchal authority. Again, one could get arrested even using that phrase today, I suppose. But a great believer in it because it was natural. And it came from the father who had power and exercised it, but in an altruistic, loving way. Some fathers obviously didn't do that, but surprisingly, most did. And it grew out of the necessity for the family to coalesce, move forward, survive, and in fact thrive. That kind of a natural authority, the authority of the father over the wife and mother, but a Christian authority, one tempered by the admonitions of Christ that one must love one's wife and, shall we say, accept her submission as Christ loved the church. But there's a naturalness to it, and within small places, natural leaders emerge. Anyone who's ever been in any kind of an organization can understand how there are people who are naturally gifted at moving things forward, at organizing people to get projects done. In a wise and healthy society, they emerge, again, in small places, within the guild, within the professional association, within the local congregation. And again, this is a natural expression of a necessary kind of authority that could only be really found in small places, in a way that, again, has a feeling of being natural. Again, we're dealing almost, like you say, with counterintuitive arguments, but authority is absolutely necessary for human society to survive and, like I say, thrive. But what kind of authority you get is the key. And again, Bonald saw it emerging out of natural human relationships. It's the first form of authority, the primal form of authority that at its best works its way up, even to the point of the good king at the very top, but who ruled his people, his kingdom, as a wise father.
Right. And that's why the king is traditionally called sire, because he's like the metaphorical father of the extended family of the nation. So this view of the family as being the ground of the state, which we'll get onto later, is really an acknowledgement of what the Catholic Catechism says by describing the family as the original social cell. That's de Bonald's vision of power growing from the most basic unit upwards.
Indeed so. And I wish I could say that kings have always behaved that way, but the good ones have. And I'm an American, we don't believe in kings over here, but I can understand the argument for monarchy, as Bonald explained it, coming out of his own experience in his own tradition. It makes perfect sense. And in my own time, I have met members of the Habsburg family, members of the Romanov family. I've met members of the Bourbon family and the Orleans family, many of whom are claimants to thrones. They're good people, and they still have, the ones I've known at least, still have a strong sense, even though they no longer rule anything, and were impoverished by and large after World War One. They still have a sense of duty and obligation. And I've met them mainly through work on trying to find ways to renew and restore and strengthen families. So there's something to this. And Bonald understood, again, that royalty and also the best aspects of aristocracy worked well to protect what was true liberty, not the false liberty being preached by the radicals in Paris.
One of his reflections on that was that authority, in his view, had to be both indivisible and decentralized. Now, why were those the two criteria that he put forward, indivisible and decentralized?
Well, to prevent abuse. I mean, I think it was quite clear. On the one hand, responsibility requires the ability to do things. You're going to, this is true even running a business corporation. If I'm responsible for the business corporation, I must have the authority for my decisions to be carried out and carried through. I mean, this is just a fundamental rule of human interaction. We sort of forget it sometimes when something like the modern economy comes up, but it's still true. You have to have the authority to pull things off. You have to, a military commander, you have to have you're given take this hill. You have to have the authority to order people and order guns and order troops and order them around to do it. So it has to be, in that sense, absolute, at least relative to the task at hand. But it also has to be kept decentralized. There again, that's why a king, who perhaps even in theory is an absolute monarch, must have, for example, a strong aristocracy, a landed aristocracy who have their own property, who have their own way of sustaining and supporting themselves, who are there as a counterbalance. And on their estates, they have absolute authority. But there it is. It's absolute, but it's also tempered. This is the great genius of Christianity. Again, when it has worked, is to temper that authority with Christian love and compassion, and humility. The wise and good and powerful leader is also a humble leader. Again, Bonald understood that, and again managed to, as you put it, find ways of of proving what seems counterintuitive, that power and must be absolute, but it also must be limited.
On this idea of making sure there's decentralization, he had a very healthy emphasis on the primacy of the family relative to the state, which really pierces the heart of any totalitarian vision that would suggest the opposite. So he writes that the state exists after the family, by the family, for the family, and it's constituted as the family. What does this really mean? And what do you think it has to teach the modern West, which in its hubris thinks it can now do without the family?
Well, another way of stating what you just read there is his argument that when the state or the people running the central government look out from their offices or their palaces, whatever it might be, they don't see individuals. What they see are families. That's what they should see. They see families, and the state, the true state, the wise state, the good state, is a collection and a community of families, not of individuals. Why is that? Well, again, the importance of marriage and family is that alone among all the other mediating institutions, it's natural, born of nature, born of human nature, born of the desire of, should say, the mutual attraction of a man and a woman who enter into marriage, and then renew the family, their own families, the two families there have united, renew their own families, and renew society by producing children. Even after the state has crushed the family legally, for example, as the Bolsheviks did in Russia in creating the Soviet Union in 1917, 1918, and so on. Again, they issued decrees to basically abolish the family in any meaningful way. 1936, they found that it wasn't working. The social order was crumbling. Parentless children were wandering around, not just because Stalin had killed their parents, but just the parents had ceased to fulfill their own responsibilities and duties. Things were going awful. And even the in some ways, the most horrible of totalitarian societies ever to exist, the Bolshevik regime of the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, they had to back off and had, in a sense, to turn back to the family just to save social order from complete chaos. So the family is naturally renewing. Which is again why the state wants to get rid of it. If the family could truly be crushed, and to be honest, the tools to do that are even more potent today than they were under the Bolsheviks. If the family can truly be destroyed, defined out of existence legally, and then destroyed economically, and finally politically, then shall we say, the totalitarian dream, sometimes called liberalism, sometimes called communism, that totalitarian dream can finally succeed. So the family is the key to stopping that.
Even in that case, what would success truly look like? Because the closest they've got to it, as you described in the Bolshevik Revolution, with women and children prostituting themselves for bread in the streets after divorce was made so easy and alimony laws were abolished. The men who implemented Alexandra Kollontais reforms, they were shot and the reforms were repealed. So I'm not even sure it could, in principle, reach that point without collapsing on itself, because it's parasitical on the family in the first place.
Well, we may find that out in the not too distant future. We may see something similar happening here. The destruction of marriage, which is a process that's well advanced now in our time, it's being done in a much more clever and a much more sweeping way. The propaganda is even something. The propaganda opportunities in our time through modern high tech agencies is something that even the Bolsheviks could not have dreamed of. And the power that's available through the popular culture, which is held tightly under control. But you're right. In the end, the chaos, which I think is emerging and will grow more so, in the years and decades ahead, at some point, the family will renew itself, and maybe it's already happening. I know there are pockets of familial renewal in the United States. There are pockets of it in Europe, pockets here and there, that a recommitment to a solid marriage, a recommitment to the acceptance and celebration of paternal authority, the desire for a large family, desire to have many children. This is happening in some places, and so far, well, it's a sign, much like you described in the 1930s, that you can suppress the family, but it will pop back up again.
Amen. Let me read you the last couple of sentences of the lecture I got fired from Eton College for, because they're a development of the comment you just made. So it concludes: the Harvard sociologist Carl Zimmerman, in his masterwork Family and Civilization, described childbearing as the main stem of the family. And my comment was that only a man and a woman can bear children. And for as long as childbearing continues, the nuclear family will continue to bury its undertakers.
It's interesting you should bring in Carl Zimmerman, because there's a direct connection between him and Bonald. Zimmerman was much influenced by Frédéric Lefebvre, another French reactionary, although he came, I guess, 2 generations after Bonald. But very much in that same tradition of what he called the STEM family. I would call it the natural family. What Bonald would call the aristocratic family, but you'll kind of all roll it in together. We were talking about pretty much the same thing. And Zimmerman's great masterwork, Family and Civilization, in some ways is a descendant of the arguments Bonald was making through Lefebvre. And he's entirely correct. And Zimmerman was one of the great masters of a historical or historicist sociology that again Bonald set in motion, along with again another fellow I mentioned earlier, Robert Nisbet, here in the United States.
So let's talk a bit more then about why Bonald was adamantly opposed to divorce. You touched on it earlier. If we look at some of the things that modern liberal academics have said about divorce, we can turn to A.C. Grayling, who famously described divorce as liberating people to more generous possibilities for living flourishing lives. And the Canadian academic and politician Michael Ignatieff described a father walking out on his sons as an act of the liberal imagination, because, according to him, it upholds an individual's needs against the devouring claims of family life. So you can see in both of those remarks, we've got this core vision of liberalism as being about the autonomy of the individual, no matter what pain it might cause the wife or the children, for example. But in Bonald's view, this is evil. Why?
For Bonald, again, going back to the origins of social and political life, marriage is fundamental. It's the first step of human relationships and the most important form of human relationship. Everything else rests on it. Again, something Aristotle would have explained in his own way a couple of millennia ago. It's absolutely critical. And put it simply, and again, a point Bonald made over and again, is any crack in the edifice of a marriage, any possibility that it can be done away with or gotten out of, opens up not just the possibility, but the probability of the husband and the wife holding back something from the relationship. And I better kind of protect myself here, not put everything, all my marbles into this relationship with my spouse. You'll hold something back. And in fact, you will allow quarrels to grow rather than trying to find ways to prevent them or to end them. Again, you're putting yourself first and you're defending yourself. And denying what had been laid out way back in Genesis 1 and 2, the one flesh marital union. You were no longer two, but one. G.K. Chesterton rephrased that as one of his delightful ways. He said, man is a four-legged creature. And I think that captures brilliantly what a one flesh marital union is meant to be. But any crack in the edifice, they'll say, well, we're not going to allow general divorce or real easy divorce, but we're going to allow some divorce, particularly for cruelty or going to be for incompatibility. They just can't get along. And why would you want to force them to stay together? The answer is you have to. Otherwise, the arguments within each marriage for, again, I'm going to get out of this, I'm tired of this, you will find a way to get out of it. You will stop putting your energy into preserving and protecting, and the marriage will find ways to end it. And again, that's what he said. It has to be an absolute. It has to be absolute. You can't let the tiniest crack in.
Disorder in marriage means disorder in the family and eventually disorder in society as well. That was a really clear answer. Thank you. He also said that marriage is monogamous. Now, what is wrong with multiple wives in his view?
Well, here he says something. Again, why do we consider him the first social scientist? And he simply says, it's obvious why that's true. Nature or nature's God or evolution, however you want to explain it, has made it true that for every 100 babies born, 50 will be male and 50 will be female. Now that points towards monogamy. One man for one woman when they grow up. What friend George Gilder used to call the sexual constitution of the West. Each young man gets one young woman and vice versa, and that's it. If, say, polygamy, one man, multiple wives, was going to work, nature or evolution would have guaranteed that for every male born, there would be 20 females. Or the other way around. If nature and nature gods were in fact was a feminist or a pimp, it would go the other way. You'd have for every female, there'd be 20 men born. But that's just not how it happened. What happens is you can just look at the natural order. Equal numbers of male and females, equal numbers of men and women, all seeking to fulfill their sexual destiny, and as men and as women. And monogamy is the only way it works. Any other system is going to rest on despotism. The kind of, for example, saw the Ottoman Empire, where the leader of the Ottomans would still have 800 wives or something. That just it can't work on a society-wide basis.
Yeah, and if people point to the fact that around 85% of all known human societies have practiced some form of multiple wives, the easy response is that the most successful societies, and certainly all the world's most successful empires, as J.D. Unwin outlined in his 1934 work, Sex and Culture, they've all been strictly monogamous, as were the earliest human beings. And if you look at the biology on this, multiple wives suppresses female fertility. So people saying, but look, there are so many societies where multiple wives has been practiced. It's not something that maximizes reproduction. Monogamous societies outbreed polygamous ones. So you can see the biological argument that you're making here in even the data from the societies that seem not to fit it.
You just outlined a very good principle of social biology. You're right. Correct.
There's another argument he makes about monogamy, which is really about the importance of fathers. And if we had, say, almost no societies have seen this, I'm aware of anyway, if we have multiple husbands and one wife, which is pretty much unheard of, what does that mean for the role of the father? And how does it give us an insight into why Bonald thinks that the father is so important within the family?
Well, again, he sees the father as the natural bearer of authority for the family. The father serves as the public face of, well, I hate the term nuclear family. We'll use the family household as, I think, a preferable phrase. Again, it comes out of human nature, the nature of man. Women. I know this again is outrageous statement, but women are better at nurturing. Women can breastfeed, and despite the efforts by some men these days to try to produce a little bit of liquid out of their nipples, it just doesn't work very well. It's an absurdity. Women are good at nurturing, particularly good at nurturing the newborns. In fact, they're absolutely essential for the newborn through breastfeeding and through the hormonal exchanges that are taking place that help the baby grow and become whole and intelligent and so on. The father is by nature a protector. The father is different. Men are different. Men are set out, and again, this is not reactionary talking. This is science talking. Men solve problems. They drive forward. They see the objective and they take it. Women are spatially represented, spatially organized. Their minds work different. One is not better than the other. Both are wonderful and both are necessary for the fruition of human life through marriage and family creation, the building of a household. The fathers that are irreplaceable. Every attempt to get along without fathers, again, as the Bolsheviks learned, resulted in total chaos. And so the father as the head of the household, that's what works. And any attempts to get around it, again, lead to pretty much disaster.
Yeah, that's that great insight that Aristotle had in his response to Plato's view that there's no particular social role that is a man's and no social role that is a woman's. And Aristotle says, no, men and women each have their particular gifts that they throw into the common stock. And it's a vision of complementarity and the two working together in harmony for the benefit of children. And you need that leader, you need that authority figure within the family. Just like, to go back to one of your previous comments, you need a business, for example, to have one person who's accountable and responsible and has the authority to lead it.
Precisely so. And again, by decree of nature, or nature's God, or evolution, however you want to take it, the father plays that role within the human family.
One of the things he was also opposed to, apart from divorce, was the forced division of property into equal shares after the father's death. Could you explain a bit more about why he opposed that?
Well, this is an interesting question. He opposed the principle of primogeniture, that the practice codified in law in the old regimes, so to speak, that the eldest son would inherit the property, except in unusual circumstances, and would inherit the whole estate, the house, the farms, the whatever else went with the other, whatever else went with it, leases, leaseholds, and so on, all would be held by one. And that person that had a responsibility as the head of the family to look after his sisters and his younger brothers, and to help his sisters find a good marriage, a good match. English literature is full of stories about that. And to help the younger brothers find their way in the professions, in the military, and so on. Now, somehow that strikes we modern egalitarians hugely unfair. And a couple of things about that. First of all, particularly in places like England and France, where, how we would put it, pretty much all of the arable land or forest land is known, population is large, and there's no new lands where you can go out west and start a farm. That happened in America. And maybe in some ways, just given the great land mass we have here, it still happens to some degree, but it couldn't happen in Europe. What would happen instead, and this was the French revolutionary government ended primogeniture. In fact, mandated the equal distribution of the estate to all siblings. It was done mostly to destroy the aristocracy and to undercut their economic base. I mean, it was a political act. But it also had social consequences, because primogeniture made sure that the economic enterprise that was the estate, or even a free, independent peasant farm, would make sure that it remained economically viable, that it could still give a living to the people living there, who resided there. Again, that was true even, like I say, of the what we'd call the family farm, or the independent free peasant farm in Europe. You had to have a certain size. Now that would change in time with different technologies and so on, but you had to be able to sustain yourself, and that was again critical to the preservation of liberty. The nobility, for example, were going to be a counterbalance to the royal authority. They had to have an independent, autonomous economic base. And to be frank, shares in a joint stock company or bonds being issued by the central government don't provide that kind of liberty. It has to be landed. It has to be property that is actually productive, real productive property. It has to be that in order for that role to take place. It was true in the United States, the Jeffersonian dream of a nation of yeoman farmers, which we sort of achieved by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Again, the justification for that was to create a freestanding part of the population who were independent and autonomous, and who had the economic means through land, forests, land, maybe ponds, rivers, and so on, to maintain that autonomy, to feed themselves, to feed their family, and to feed their friends and followers. You had to have that ability to pull that off. So primogeniture also undercut that. The end of primogeniture undercut that as well. And I'm going to give you a very specific example, though. This is all it's about the nobility. Something that happened, it's a hot issue in the United States right now, which is reparations for Blacks, African Americans. They want reparations because they felt they were badly treated after the Civil War, after the end of slavery. And they've got a point. When slavery was ended by war in 1865, what Blacks wanted primarily was land. They wanted the vote too, but the first choice was they wanted to have land because they bought into the Jeffersonian dream of a freestanding farm as the only true form of liberty. They wanted land, and the government promised them land. They were going to give 40 acres and a mule. They'll break up the old Southern plantations and give 40 acres and a mule to each former slave family. And that didn't happen. Outside of a few early efforts, it just ended. The old Southern regime came back, and the plantations found new forms through sharecropping and other means. Nonetheless, African Americans, starting about 1870, began to buy land down south, but quite a bit. And by 1910, from basically zero, there were now over 200,000 Black-owned, owner-operated farms in the South. Another 700,000 farms had been created, operating sometimes on shares, sometimes on a mix of some land-owned and some shares. And by that time, 1 out of every 3 farms in the South was Black-owned and Black-operated. Nationwide, 1 of every 7 farms in the United States was a Black-owned or a Black-operated farm. That was 1910. By the year 2000, of those 900,000 farms that had been Black-owned and operated, by the year 2000, only about 18,000 were still there. There had been a decline of 98%. And African Americans have claimed that this was the result of racism. And there's some evidence of that, particularly in the way federal programs were managed, particularly down south. But that aside, the real cause, though, the primary cause, was the same problem we're talking about, the end of primogeniture, or an inability to find a substitute, or to maintain a substitute. White farmers tended to pass on their farms to eldest sons, sometimes daughters and so on, but generally, if they're going to keep the farm going as an enterprise, they would keep it within the family. One of the children would take over the farm, the other children would find other ways to get along. That didn't happen among Black families. For reasons that are not entirely well known, Black families almost always, on the death of the farm owner, divided the property up among the siblings, or sometimes maybe some aunts and uncles got in there. The first time you do that, for the first generation, maybe you're dividing a going farm into three or four parts. But do that over 3 or 4 generations, and the farms disappear. You've got 100 acres, or say 40 hectares, owned by 30 people, and there's no way in which that's a going enterprise. So what always happens is the farm, somebody will take court, the farm will be sold, everybody takes their 1/20th share. But the land is then almost always was bought up by consolidators, particularly building corporate farms. And so the Black farming class in America disappeared, literally disappeared, because we didn't have some sort of a system of primogeniture. Now they're trying to figure out, well, how can we make up for that? There's some ideas out there, some of which I favor, but the point is, that's not an old issue. This is a current issue. And even on a hot, contentious question of reparations in the United States, failure to have a system of primogeniture created the problem.
That's interesting. So the connection between strong families and then keeping the family estate together in one piece so it's not diluted over the generations, that's really the core of his objection to this practice of it being dissolved on the father's death. You can see
Precisely.
that you can see that
Precisely.
in the destruction of the great British estates over the years as well. It's exactly the same process that's played out. So it's one prong of the attack on patriarchy. We mentioned religion as one of the intermediary groups or societies before. Why, in a nutshell, did Bonald think that religion was important to society?
Well, again, as I mentioned, he was raised within a strongly Catholic family, uh, absorbed his catechetical training, believed it, never wavered in his faith in the church, and abandoned his hopes for the early French Revolution when the revolution turned against the church. Why is religion important? Well, it is the salve, the ointment, the oil, so to speak, that makes the whole thing operate. Um, Particularly, well, all of the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, all stress strongly the the act of charity, the act of almsgiving, uh, whatever it might be called, as one of the central, as perhaps the central obligation, or certainly one of the central social obligations that every believer must show and engage in. In a truly free society of the kind that Bonald wanted, the church, in its ministrations, both spiritually but also physically, in the hospitals it's created, in the support for the poor that it would mobilize. This was the way in which a free society would operate. I mean, in some ways, there's kind of a libertarian in Bonald. He just as maybe you could say a word about divorce too. I'll explain why he's a libertarian when it comes to divorce. But this was instead of having a welfare state, what we have is a religious state that provides the support and necessary to help people who can't live in families or who are fallen on hard times. It makes the whole system operate. It deals with the troubles which inevitably emerge in among human beings who are fallen creatures and prone to sin and mistakes and errors, or in some cases through no fault of their own, through handicaps, through the death of their parents or the orphans. Religion solves those problems.
I think the West is learning that the hard way, and we should have listened to him the first time around. He mentions a particular concern about industrialization, which is that it damages the social bonds of church, family, and village, resulting in alienation. And I think this is a really subtle point about the way in which some forms of capitalism can be like an acid to the family. And he was very prophetic in this observation. How can that result in alienation? I guess this question is a good one to finish off on because it sums up so many of his concerns about the weakening of the family.
I think Chesterton once said that while it is surely true, it appears to be true that socialism attacks the family in theory, capitalism attacks the family in practice. What is he getting at? And again, I think Bonald would agree with that statement 100%. What it is that the modern joint stock industrial corporation is no longer, unlike feudalism, which involved the, should we say, pledges of reciprocal privileges between lord and serf by families and through families. Modern capitalism does not work through families. Early capitalism had some experiments with that. It just didn't work out very well. Fathers kept interfering with the to protect their wives from corporate demands or their children, and so they throw that out. What capitalism wants is a free, radical individual, just like the modern state wants a free, radical individual without any ties or any obligations. They want workers who will work cheap. They certainly don't want a worker who's trying to support, say, 10 people on a salary, a wife and 9 children back home. They want to get rid of the concept of a family wage. Why? Because get more work for less money. Also, families get in the way of the efficient allocation of labor. Could be that my best use is pushing a button on a machine in New York City, whereas my wife's best use is washing laundry in Florida, and my children's best use is helping to mine coal in West Virginia. But the families doesn't move. That a strong family stays together rather than finding where they belong in the system. Again, if you don't have any family, you don't have any ties, no marriages you have to worry about, no parental children obligations. That's the best if you're an employer. And you say, well, what about? There's evidence to show that then fathers will work harder than non-fathers because they have a sense they got to feed their children, and that's true to a modest degree. But again, particularly modern globalist capitalism, it's just at some point they're demanding a minimum wage that will sustain a family. We'll just move to Vietnam, or we'll start a plant in Malaya, and or Mexico, and get people to work for a lot cheaper, and don't have to worry about family ties. So the system kind of consumes families. I think that's what I think Bonald was getting at.
I agree. I think that's a very stark warning for everyone listening. And the idea of a family wage has been a concern of so many of the popes in modern times as well, and how it's vital that we get back to single income families so that we can strengthen the family again. For people who have had their ears pricked up by some of the concepts that we've discussed today, which one of your books would you recommend first to get a better exploration of some of this territory?
Well, I did a book that's back in print now called Third Ways. It's mostly European examples, including a look at Belloc and Chesterton, but also at the agrarian movements of Europe and in Russia 100 years ago, which came close to building an alternate society, a true third way. I've also looked at the remarkable story, rarely read these days or understood, of the emergence of the Swedish socialist housewives movement. It sounds like a bad TV show, but it was really true. And they actually were quite successful in tempering the worst aspects of Swedish social democracy in favor of the family for about 30 years. So I looked at these kind of episodes. So it's called Third Ways. And let's see, how Bulgarian Greens, Swedish housewives, and beer-spilling Englishmen built family-centered economies and why they disappeared.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Dr. Allan Carlson, this has been a really insightful interview, and I think people will be able to take away lots of new lines for research and discussion. I really appreciate it.
I'm happy to have been with you.
Take care. Hope to speak again one time. Bye.
Well, I hope so too.